the screams that echoed through Willowbrook Estate on the night of September 23, 1847, weren't the joyful sounds of celebration. They were the agonized cries of 17 people dying in ways that no human being should ever experience. In the grand dining room, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across mahogany walls, Colonel Benjamin Hartwell's 50th birthday feast had transformed into a chamber of horrors that would haunt Natchez, Mississippi for generations to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What began as an evening of merriment among the Mississippi River elite ended with bodies convulsing on imported Persian rugs, their faces twisted in expressions of unbearable agony as their organs shut down one by one. The lavish birthday celebration, complete with the finest delicacies that Southern hospitality could offer, had become a carefully orchestrated execution that would forever change how plantation society viewed the enslaved people who prepared their meals. But the true horror of that night wasn't just in the deaths themselves. It was in the realization that the woman responsible for this massacre had served the Hartwell family faithfully for over a decade, earning their trust meal by meal, smile by smile, until she was granted access to the very heart of their domestic world. Mercy Thompson had transformed the most fundamental act of hospitality into an instrument of devastating revenge. The Mississippi River bluffs had witnessed countless tragedies over the centuries, from Native American battles to steamboat disasters, but nothing had prepared the residents of Natchez for the carnage that Sheriff William Garrett discovered when he arrived at Willowbrook Estate shortly after midnight. The urgent message delivered by a terrified house slave had spoken of widespread illness, but the reality that greeted law enforcement was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. 17 bodies lay scattered throughout the mansion's elegant dining room, some still seated at the massive oak table where they had shared their final meal. Others collapsed on the floor where they had fallen while attempting to flee their mysterious affliction. Colonel Benjamin Hartwell himself sat slumped in his chair at the head of the table, his military bearing forever lost to the violent spasms that had marked his final moments. His wife, Constance, had managed to rise from her seat before succumbing near the marble fireplace. Her silk gown spread around her like spilled wine. The birthday cake still sat pristine on its silver pedestal, surrounded by the remnants of what had been a magnificent feast. Roasted venison with wild mushroom gravy, fresh catfish from the Mississippi, cornbread made with the finest white flour, and an array of preserves and delicacies that represented the pinnacle of antebellum Southern cuisine. The irony was not lost on Sheriff Garrett that such abundance had become the vehicle for such destruction. Dr. Nathaniel Price arrived within the hour, his medical bag clutched tightly as he surveyed a scene that challenged everything he understood about disease and death. The symptoms he observed were unlike anything in his 20 years of medical practice. The victims showed signs of severe gastrointestinal distress, but there was something more systematic and deliberate about their condition. Their pupils were dilated, their skin had taken on a yellowish pallor, and several showed evidence of liver failure that seemed to have progressed with impossible speed. What disturbed Dr. Price most profoundly was the selective nature of the deaths. Every white person who had attended the birthday celebration was either dead or dying, but the house slaves who had served the meal remained completely unaffected. Ruby, Mercy's assistant in the kitchen, stood in the doorway wringing her hands with what appeared to be genuine shock and horror. Samuel, the butler who had supervised the evening service, maintained his composure, but his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had witnessed the impossible. The guest list read like a directory of Natchez high society. Judge Thomas Pemberton, whose legal decisions had shaped the region for decades, lay motionless beside the crystal decanter he had been reaching for when the poison claimed him. Captain James Mitchell, whose riverboat empire had made him one of the wealthiest men in Mississippi, had collapsed near the French doors that opened onto the estate's famous rose garden. The Blackwood family from neighboring Riverside Plantation were found together near the piano, where Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood had been preparing to perform for the evening's entertainment. Even Reverend Joshua Mills, who had been invited to offer the blessing before the meal, had not been spared. The man who had spent his life preaching about divine justice had become a victim of a very earthly form of retribution. His final sermon, delivered just hours before his death, had ironically focused on the theme of reaping what one sows. Sheriff Garrett methodically examined each body, noting the progression of symptoms and the approximate time of death. The consistency of the victims' conditions suggested a single source of contamination, most likely something they had all consumed during the dinner. But identifying the specific cause would require careful investigation of every dish that had been served, every ingredient that had been used, and every person who had access to the food preparation areas. The mansion itself seemed to mock the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Willowbrook Estate represented 3 generations of accumulated wealth, built on the backs of enslaved labor, and maintained through the systematic exploitation of human beings treated as property. The Greek Revival architecture, with its imposing columns and elaborate cornices, had been designed to project power and permanence. Tonight, that facade of invincibility had been shattered by someone the family had trusted completely. In the kitchen house, connected to the main mansion by a covered walkway, the evidence of the evening's meal preparation remained scattered across wooden work surfaces. Cast iron pots still contained remnants of the dishes that had been served, their contents now taking on a sinister significance. The largest pot, which had held the venison and mushroom stew that Colonel Benjamin Hartwell was particularly favorite, sat empty except for a thin layer of gravy that clung to its bottom. Mercy Thompson stood in the corner of the kitchen, her face a mask of confusion and distress that seemed entirely genuine to the casual observer. She had served the Hartwell family for 12 years, rising from a field hand to the trusted position of head cook through her exceptional culinary skills and apparent loyalty. Her reputation for creating elaborate meals had
made her an invaluable asset to a family that prided itself on entertaining the social elite of the Mississippi River region. The relationship between Mercy and the Hartwell family had always appeared to follow the prescribed patterns of plantation life. She demonstrated the appropriate deference when addressing her owners, maintained the careful distance that the social order demanded, and performed her duties with the kind of efficiency that made slavery seem almost benevolent to those who benefited from it. But beneath that carefully constructed facade, a very different dynamic had been developing for months. The immediate challenge facing Sheriff Garrett was determining whether this tragedy represented an accident or a deliberate act of murder. Mushroom poisoning was not uncommon in rural areas where people foraged for wild varieties, and even experienced gatherers sometimes made fatal mistakes. The symptoms he observed were consistent with several types of toxic mushrooms that grew in the hardwood forests surrounding Natchez. But the timing and scope of the poisoning suggested something far more calculated than a simple foraging error. Dr. Price began the grim task of examining each victim more closely, looking for clues that might indicate the specific type of poison involved. The progression of symptoms suggested a toxin that attacked the liver and kidneys with particular virulence, causing rapid organ failure while leaving the nervous system largely intact until the final stages. This pattern pointed toward emetoxin poisoning, the deadly compound found in deathcap mushrooms and their related species. The investigation that would follow would reveal layers of deception, long-suppressed rage, and a form of justice that operated outside any legal framework. But as Sheriff Garrett stood in that elegant dining room, surrounded by the evidence of systematic murder, he could not have imagined that the soft
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
spoken woman who had prepared the fatal meal had been planning this moment for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to balance scales that had been weighted against her and her people for generations. The silence that settled over Willowbrook Estate that night was different from the peaceful quiet of a satisfied household settling in for sleep. It was the heavy silence of secrets about to be exposed, of a social order about to confront the consequences of its own brutality, and of a woman who had discovered that sometimes the only justice available is the kind you serve yourself. The birthday celebration that was meant to honor Colonel Hartwell's half-century of life had instead marked the beginning of his family's destruction and the emergence of a story that would challenge every assumption about power, loyalty, and revenge in the antebellum South. As dawn approached over the Mississippi River bluffs, the magnitude of what had occurred at Willowbrook Estate began to sink in. 17 prominent citizens dead in a single evening, killed by someone they had trusted implicitly, in a manner that revealed the vulnerability at the heart of the plantation system. The enslaved people who prepared the food, who moved through the intimate spaces of white households, who were present but invisible during the most private family moments, possessed a kind of access that could be weaponized by someone with sufficient motivation and knowledge. The story of Mercy Thompson's revenge would spread through the slave quarters of every plantation in Mississippi, carried by the networks of communication that existed entirely outside the awareness of white society. It would become a legend that offered hope to the hopeless and fear to those who had believed themselves untouchable. But the woman at the center of that legend faced a future that would test every assumption about justice, survival, and the price of fighting back against a system designed to crush the human spirit. Part 2. The World of Willowbrook Estate. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cotton fields of Willowbrook Estate, where 300 enslaved souls began another day of back-breaking labor under the watchful eyes of overseers who carried whips as casually as other men carried pocket watches. The plantation stretched for over 2,000 acres along the Mississippi River bluffs, its boundaries marked by ancient oak trees whose gnarled branches had witnessed decades of human suffering disguised as Southern prosperity. Mercy Thompson had awakened before dawn in the cramped quarters she shared with her 12-year-old son, Jacob, her mind already racing through the preparations required for what would become the most significant day of her life. The wooden cabin that housed them measured barely 12 feet square, with a dirt floor and walls that did little to keep out the Mississippi humidity. A single window covered with oiled paper provided the only natural light, and the furnishings consisted of 2 straw mattresses, a wooden crate that served as a table, and hooks on the wall for their meager possessions. The relationship between the enslaved community and the Hartwell family operated according to rules that had been established through generations of systematic oppression. Colonel Benjamin Hartwell prided himself on being a reasonable master, meaning he provided adequate food rations and rarely resorted to the most extreme forms of physical punishment. This relative benevolence, however, came with expectations of absolute loyalty and gratitude that made any form of resistance seem like the ultimate betrayal of trust. Mercy had earned her position as head cook through a combination of exceptional culinary skill and what the Hartwell family interpreted as genuine devotion to their welfare. She had arrived at Willowbrook as a field hand in 1835, purchased from a failing plantation in Alabama, along with several other workers. Her ability to transform simple ingredients into elaborate meals had quickly caught the attention of Mrs. Constance Hartwell, who recognized that a talented cook could significantly enhance the family's social standing in Natchez society. The kitchen house, where Mercy spent most of her waking hours, stood 30 feet from the main mansion, connected by a covered walkway that allowed food to be transported while maintaining the separation that social conventions demanded. The building itself was larger than most slave quarters, with 2 main rooms devoted to food preparation and storage, along with a smaller area where Mercy could rest during the long hours between meal services. Cast-iron pots of various sizes hung from hooks along the walls, and wooden shelves held an impressive array of spices and seasonings that reflected the Hartwell family's wealth and refined tastes. The daily routine of meal preparation began at 4 in the morning, when Mercy would light the fires in the massive stone hearth that dominated the kitchen space. Ruby, her primary assistant, would arrive shortly thereafter to light the fires in the massive stone hearth that dominated the kitchen space. Ruby, her primary assistant, would arrive shortly thereafter to begin the preparations for breakfast, a generous meal often consisting of coarse and small game shared by the family members and visiting relatives.
help with the endless tasks of chopping vegetables, kneading bread dough, and tending the various dishes that comprised each meal. The two women worked in a rhythm developed over years of collaboration, their movements efficient and synchronized as they transformed raw ingredients into the elaborate presentations that Colonel Hartwell demanded. The social hierarchy within the slave community at Willowbrook reflected the complex dynamics that existed on most large plantations. House slaves, like Mercy, occupied a privileged position relative to field workers, with better living conditions, superior clothing, and access to information about the white family's activities. This privilege came at the cost of constant surveillance and the psychological burden of maintaining a facade of contentment while serving people who owned them completely. Samuel, the butler who supervised the male house servants, had been born at Willowbrook and knew no other life than service to the Hartwell family. His father had been the previous butler, and his grandfather before that, creating a legacy of domestic servitude that spanned 3 generations. Samuel's loyalty appeared genuine to his owners, but those who knew him well understood that his survival depended on maintaining perfect performance in a role that required him to anticipate the needs of people who viewed him as sophisticated property. Grace, who managed the laundry and general cleaning, represented another category within the household hierarchy. Her work brought her into intimate contact with the personal belongings of the white family, giving her access to information and opportunities that could be valuable to those seeking to understand their owner's vulnerabilities. The trust required for such access was built slowly over years of demonstrated reliability, creating relationships that resembled genuine affection but were always underlaid by the fundamental reality of ownership. The field slaves who comprised the majority of Willowbrook's enslaved population lived in conditions that starkly contrasted with the relative comfort of the house servants. Their quarters consisted of rows of wooden cabins with clay-chinked walls, each housing multiple families in spaces designed for maximum occupancy rather than human dignity. The workday began before sunrise and continued until darkness, with brief breaks for meals that barely provided sufficient calories for the physical demands of cotton cultivation. Isaiah, who served as crew leader for one of the field gangs, commanded respect within the slave community through his ability to protect his workers from the worst excesses of overseer brutality while maintaining productivity levels that satisfied the white management. His position required him to navigate between the competing demands of survival and solidarity, making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for those under his supervision. Old Moses occupied a unique position within the plantation's social structure. Too elderly for heavy field work, but possessed of knowledge that made him valuable in other ways, he spent his days tending the vegetable gardens that provided fresh produce for both the main house and slave quarters. His unofficial role as historian and advisor to younger enslaved people gave him influence that transcended formal authority structures. Martha, the midwife and healer who attended to medical needs throughout the slave community, possessed skills that made her indispensable despite her advanced age. Her knowledge of herbal remedies and traditional healing practices had saved countless lives over the decades, earning her a level of respect that even extended to some members of the white family. The medical knowledge she carried had been passed down through generations of women who understood that survival often depended on understanding which plants could heal and which could kill. The economic foundation of Willowbrook Estate rested on the systematic exploitation of human labor to produce cotton for export markets. The plantation's annual yield of over 400 bales generated enormous profits that funded the Hartwell family's lavish lifestyle and social prominence. Colonel Hartwell's military background had given him organizational skills that he applied to plantation management with ruthless efficiency, treating enslaved workers as units of production whose value could be calculated in precise financial terms. The domestic sphere of the main house represented a different kind of theater, where enslaved people performed roles designed to maintain the illusion of harmonious relationships between masters and servants. The elaborate meals, perfectly maintained household, and seamless service that characterized daily life at Willowbrook required enormous effort and coordination from dozens of workers whose own needs were considered secondary to the comfort of their owners. Mrs. Constance Hartwell took particular pride in her reputation as a gracious hostess, frequently entertaining guests from throughout the Mississippi River region. These social events required elaborate preparation and flawless execution from the house staff, who understood that any mistakes would result in punishment that could range from reduced food rations to physical beatings. The pressure to maintain perfection in service created an atmosphere of constant tension that wore down even the most resilient individuals. Victoria Hartwell, the colonel's daughter, represented the next generation of plantation society and the continuation of systems that treated human beings as property. Her recent engagement to the son of another prominent planting family promised to expand the Hartwell influence while perpetuating the social structures that made such wealth possible. The elaborate wedding being planned for the following spring would showcase the family's prosperity and social connections while requiring months of preparation from enslaved workers whose own family relationships remained subject to the arbitrary decisions of their owners. The seasonal rhythms of plantation life created periods of intense activity alternating with relative calm, but for enslaved people there was never true rest from the demands of serving others. Cotton planting and harvesting seasons brought longer workdays and increased pressure, while winter months offered some respite from field work but maintained the constant requirements of household service and maintenance tasks. The legal framework that supported slavery in Mississippi provided absolute authority to plantation owners while offering no protection to enslaved people beyond the economic incentive to preserve valuable property. Colonel Hartwell's position as a prominent citizen and former military officer gave him additional influence within local law enforcement and judicial systems, making any challenge to his authority virtually impossible.
Impossible through legal means.
The early morning hours when other workers were still sleeping and the White family had not yet begun their daily routines, the learning process involved multiple expeditions into the hardwood forests that covered much of the land surrounding the plantation, where Moses would point out distinguishing characteristics of different species while explaining the traditional uses that his ancestors had discovered over centuries of careful observation. The deadly varieties received particular attention, not because Moses intended any harm, but because understanding their properties was essential for avoiding accidental poisoning when gathering food for survival. The Amanita species that grew in the Mississippi forests included several varieties that contained amatoxins, capable of causing liver and kidney failure in doses as small as a single mushroom cap. These species were particularly dangerous because their initial taste was reportedly pleasant, and the onset of symptoms could be delayed for hours after consumption, making it difficult to identify the source of poisoning until treatment became impossible. Moses's knowledge extended beyond simple identification to include information about seasonal patterns, optimal harvesting times, and preparation methods that could either reduce or concentrate the potency of various compounds. This expertise had been developed through generations of people who depended on forest resources for survival and who understood that such knowledge could be the difference between life and death in desperate circumstances. The conversations between Mercy and Moses gradually evolved from practical instruction about safe foraging to broader discussions about the properties of dangerous plants and their potential applications. Moses never explicitly suggested harmful uses for this knowledge, but his teachings included details about dosage, preparation methods, and symptom progression that could easily be applied for purposes other than accident prevention. The turning point in Mercy's psychological state came during a conversation with Colonel Hartwell about Jacob's future that revealed the Colonel's true intentions regarding her son. The discussion occurred in the kitchen while Mercy was preparing the evening meal, creating a casual atmosphere that encouraged the Colonel to speak more freely than he might have in more formal circumstances. Colonel Hartwell had been reviewing his financial records and considering various options for optimizing the plantation's profitability when he mentioned his plans for Jacob's development as a worker. The boy's intelligence and quick learning ability had impressed several visitors, leading to suggestions that he might be more valuable as a house servant or even as a skilled craftsman who could generate additional income through outside employment. The Colonel's casual mention that he had received an inquiry from a sugar plantation in Louisiana about purchasing young male slaves capable of learning skilled positions struck Mercy like a physical blow. The sugar plantations were notorious for their brutal working conditions and high mortality rates, representing a death sentence disguised as a business transaction. The realization that Colonel Hartwell was seriously considering such a sale shattered whatever illusions Mercy might have maintained about her family's security. The conversation continued with the Colonel explaining his reasoning in terms that revealed his complete inability to understand the human impact of his decisions. Jacob's sale would generate significant capital that could be invested in additional land purchases, while his removal would eliminate what the Colonel saw as a potential source of future problems as the boy matured into adulthood. The casual tone of these remarks demonstrated how thoroughly the Colonel had internalized the view of enslaved people as property whose value could be calculated in purely financial terms. Mercy's response to this revelation required enormous self-control to avoid revealing the rage and desperation that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained facade of compliance. She continued her food preparation while the Colonel spoke, nodding at appropriate moments and maintaining the deferential demeanor that was expected of her, while her mind raced through the implications of what she had learned. The timeline for Jacob's potential sale was still uncertain, but the Colonel's mention of spring as a likely period for such transactions created a countdown that would dominate Mercy's thoughts in the weeks that followed. The knowledge that she had perhaps 6 months to find some way to protect her son from a fate that would effectively end his life transformed her relationship with every aspect of plantation life. The psychological transformation that began with this conversation would eventually lead Mercy to consider options that she had never previously contemplated. The gradual shift from passive resistance to active planning required her to reconcile her moral beliefs with the harsh realities of a system that offered no legal or social remedies for the injustices she faced daily. The Colonel's birthday celebration, originally viewed as simply another demanding event requiring her professional skills, began to take on different significance as Mercy considered the gathering of prominent citizens who supported and benefited from the system that threatened to destroy her family. The opportunity to demonstrate her expertise in mushroom preparation for such an influential audience acquired symbolic importance that transcended mere culinary excellence. The weeks following the conversation about Jacob's future were marked by subtle changes in Mercy's behavior that reflected her evolving mental state. She became more withdrawn during periods when she was not actively engaged in food preparation, spending longer periods in solitary reflection that allowed her to process the implications of her situation. Her interactions with other enslaved workers became more cautious as she struggled with thoughts that she could not safely share with anyone. The relationship between Mercy and Jacob took on increased intensity as she found herself studying his face and mannerisms with the desperate attention of someone trying to memorize details that might soon be lost forever. The boy's natural curiosity and intelligence, which had always been sources of pride and hope, now seemed like cruel reminders of potential that would be systematically destroyed if the Colonel's plans came to fruition. Part 4. Old Moses and the Forest's Deadly Secrets. The pre-dawn hours at Willowbrook Estate carried a particular quality of silence that old Moses had learned to treasure during his 73 years of life. The period between 3 and 5 in the morning offered the only time when an elderly slave could move through the plantation grounds without constant supervision, using the darkness to tend to his own little garden or meet other elderly workers to share news or concerns.
Personal needs and private thoughts that had no place in the carefully orchestrated performance of daytime servitude. Moses had been born into slavery on a smaller plantation in South Carolina, where his grandmother had maintained the traditional knowledge of plant medicine that had been brought from Africa generations earlier. Her teachings had been passed down through whispered conversations and careful demonstrations, creating a repository of information about the healing and harmful properties of American plants that could only be shared with those trusted enough to use such knowledge responsibly. The journey that brought Moses to Willowbrook had included sales, transfers, and family separations that were routine in the slave economy, but devastating to those who experienced them. His arrival in Mississippi 25 years earlier had marked the beginning of a new phase of life where his accumulated knowledge became a survival tool for himself and other enslaved people who had no access to professional medical care. The gardens that Moses tended behind the slave quarters served multiple purposes beyond their obvious function of providing vegetables for plantation meals. The seemingly random arrangement of plants included medicinal herbs grown from seeds and cuttings that Moses had carefully preserved and cultivated over decades of careful stewardship. The knowledge required to maintain these healing plants represented a form of resistance that operated entirely outside the awareness of plantation management. The relationship between Moses and the younger enslaved workers had evolved into an informal educational system where traditional knowledge was transmitted through practical demonstrations and hands-on experience. The younger people who worked with Moses in the gardens learned not only about agriculture, but also about the properties of plants that could treat common ailments ranging from digestive problems to infected wounds. Martha, the plantation midwife, had been one of Moses's most dedicated students during her younger years, learning to identify and prepare remedies that proved essential for managing the health crises that regularly affected the slave community. Her current expertise in treating everything from difficult births to childhood diseases reflected decades of careful study under Moses's guidance, combined with her own innovations and discoveries. The forest expeditions that Moses undertook for mushroom gathering served as opportunities to expand his knowledge while teaching younger people about the complex ecosystem that surrounded the plantation. These trips required careful timing and route planning to avoid detection by overseers who might question why enslaved workers were venturing into areas not directly related to their assigned duties. The hardwood forests of Mississippi contained an abundance of edible and medicinal fungi that experienced foragers could harvest safely, but the same environment also harbored species that could cause everything from mild illness to rapid death. The knowledge required to distinguish between beneficial and dangerous varieties had been accumulated through generations of careful observation and occasionally tragic mistakes. Moses's first lesson with Mercy about mushroom identification had occurred during one of these forest expeditions, when she had expressed interest in expanding her culinary repertoire to include more sophisticated preparations featuring wild ingredients. The conversation had begun innocently enough, with Moses explaining basic techniques for identifying safe varieties that could enhance the flavors of traditional dishes. The progression from basic safety information to more detailed discussions about dangerous species reflected Moses's teaching philosophy of providing comprehensive knowledge rather than simple rules. His grandmother had taught him that understanding the full spectrum of plant properties made it possible to avoid accidents while also recognizing opportunities for beneficial uses that might not be obvious to casual observers. The amanita mushrooms that grew throughout the Mississippi forests represented one of the most dangerous categories that Moses described during his teaching sessions with Mercy. These species included several varieties that contained amatoxins capable of causing fatal liver and kidney damage in remarkably small doses, making them among the most lethal naturally occurring poisons available in the regional environment. The physical characteristics that distinguish deadly amanitas from safe mushroom varieties required careful attention to subtle details that could easily be overlooked by inexperienced gatherers. The white gills, bulbous stem base, and persistent ring around the stem provided identifying features that Moses emphasized repeatedly during his instruction, stressing that even experienced foragers sometimes made fatal mistakes when working in unfamiliar territory. The seasonal patterns that govern mushroom growth in Mississippi forests created windows of opportunity when specific varieties would be most abundant and potent. The late summer and early autumn months produce optimal conditions for Amanita species, when recent rainfall and moderate temperatures combine to support the rapid development of mature fruiting bodies containing maximum concentrations of toxic compounds. The preparation methods that could be used to concentrate or reduce the potency of mushroom toxins represented advanced knowledge that Moses shared reluctantly and only with individuals he trusted completely. The techniques for drying, grinding, and extracting active compounds had been developed through generations of traditional medicine practice, but the same methods could obviously be applied for harmful purposes by someone with malicious intent. The conversation between Moses and Mercy that would prove most significant occurred during a September morning when both had risen early to complete tasks before the day's heat became unbearable. The casual nature of their interaction disguised the importance of information that would later shape the course of events at Willowbrook Estate in ways that neither could have anticipated. Moses had been gathering late-season vegetables from the garden plots when Mercy approached him with questions about mushroom varieties that might be suitable for the Colonel's upcoming birthday celebration. Her reputation for creating elaborate dishes had led to requests for increasingly sophisticated presentations, and she hoped to surprise the assembled guests with preparations that would demonstrate her expertise with local ingredients. The discussion began with practical considerations about which species would be available during the planned time frame and where the best specimens might be found in the surrounding forests. Moses provided
detailed guidance about optimal harvesting locations and timing, sharing knowledge accumulated through decades of careful observation and successful foraging experiences. The conversation gradually expanded to include more detailed information about mushroom identification and preparation techniques, with Moses explaining the subtle differences between species that might appear similar to untrained eyes but had vastly different properties. His teaching methods emphasized the importance of absolute certainty in identification, since even small mistakes could have serious consequences. The specific information about Amanita mushrooms emerged naturally from this broader discussion, as Moses explained why certain areas of the forest should be avoided and which physical characteristics provided reliable warning signs of dangerous species. His descriptions included details about the progression of amatoxin poisoning that had been observed in accidental cases over the years, information that was intended to emphasize the importance of careful identification procedures. Mercy listened to these explanations with the focused attention that had made her such an effective student of cooking techniques, asking detailed questions about preparation methods and dosage considerations that Moses interpreted as evidence of her commitment to safety. Her inquiries about symptom timing and detection methods seemed like responsible preparation for managing potential emergencies rather than planning for deliberate harm. The knowledge that Moses shared during this conversation included information about the delayed onset of amatoxin poisoning, which could create a window of several hours between consumption and the appearance of initial symptoms. This characteristic made Amanita poisoning particularly dangerous because victims might consume lethal doses without realizing their danger until treatment became impossible. The detailed descriptions of symptom progression that Moses provided were based on his observations of accidental poisoning cases that had occurred over the years, tragic incidents that had taught hard lessons about the importance of absolute caution when dealing with wild mushrooms. The initial phase of gastrointestinal distress was followed by a deceptive period of apparent recovery before the onset of liver and kidney failure that characterized fatal amatoxin poisoning. The conversation concluded with Moses providing specific guidance about harvesting techniques and storage methods that would preserve the potency of mushroom specimens while maintaining their appearance and texture for culinary applications. This practical information was intended to help Mercy create impressive dishes for the Colonel's celebration, while avoiding any safety risks that might reflect poorly on her professional competence. Part 5. Jacob's Threatened Future.
The late September afternoon when Colonel Hartwell summoned Mercy to his study marked the beginning of a countdown that would transform every aspect of her existence at Willowbrook Estate. The Colonel's private office, located on the second floor of the main house, served as the nerve center for plantation operations, and the place where decisions affecting hundreds of lives were made with the same casual attention that other men might give to selecting their evening attire. The room itself reflected the Colonel's military background and business acumen, with detailed maps of the plantation boundaries covering one wall and ledger books containing financial records occupying a massive oak desk that had belonged to his father. The atmosphere conveyed authority and permanence, creating an environment designed to reinforce the social hierarchy that made such concentrated power possible. Mercy had been called to the study to discuss menu planning for the upcoming birthday celebration, a conversation that began with routine considerations about guest preferences and ingredient availability. The Colonel's initial comments focused on his desire to impress several influential visitors with preparations that would demonstrate Willowbrook's reputation for exceptional hospitality and Mercy's legendary culinary skills. The discussion gradually expanded to include broader topics related to plantation management and the Colonel's plans for optimizing various aspects of the operation. His casual manner during these conversations reflected his view of Mercy as a trusted subordinate, whose expertise made her a valuable asset in achieving his social and business objectives, while remaining fundamentally his property to be managed according to his best judgment. The revelation about Jacob's future emerged during this broader discussion of resource allocation and strategic planning, when Colonel Hartwell mentioned several opportunities he was considering for generating additional capital to fund expansion projects. His tone remained conversational and matter-of-fact as he described various options, including the sale of some younger slaves who might command premium prices in current market conditions. The specific mention of interest from Louisiana sugar plantations in acquiring young male slaves capable of learning skilled positions struck Mercy with the force of a physical blow, though she managed to maintain her outward composure through years of practiced self-control. The Colonel's description of Jacob as particularly valuable due to his intelligence and adaptability made clear that this was not merely a theoretical consideration, but an active possibility being seriously evaluated. Colonel Hartwell explained his reasoning with the detached logic of a businessman analyzing investment opportunities, noting that Jacob's sale could generate sufficient capital to purchase additional land that would ultimately increase the plantation's productive capacity. The boy's removal would also eliminate what the Colonel viewed as potential future complications, since intelligent young slaves sometimes developed ideas about freedom that could prove disruptive to plantation discipline. The timeline for implementing these plans remained fluid, but the Colonel's references to spring as an optimal period for slave sales created a specific framework that would dominate Mercy's thoughts in the weeks that followed. The knowledge that she had perhaps 6 months to find some way to prevent this transaction transformed her relationship with every aspect of daily life at Willowbrook. The conversation continued with the Colonel seeking Mercy's input on practical matters related to the birthday celebration, apparently unaware that his casual revelation about Jacob's fate had fundamentally altered the context of their interaction. Her responses remained professional and appropriate, while her mind raced through the implications of what she had learned and the limited options available for protecting her son. The economic realities that drove the Colonel's decision-making
Process reflected broader patterns within the slave economy that treated human beings as liquid assets to be bought and sold according to market conditions and financial needs. Jacob's intelligence and potential, which should have been sources of hope for his future, had instead made him more valuable as a commodity and therefore more likely to be separated from his family. The specific destination being considered for Jacob's sale added another dimension of horror to the Colonel's plans, since Louisiana sugar plantations were notorious for working conditions that amounted to slow-motion execution for most enslaved workers. The brutal demands of sugar cultivation, combined with disease-ridden environments and sadistic management practices, created mortality rates that made such assignments equivalent to death sentences.
Mercy's knowledge of conditions on sugar plantations came from stories shared by other enslaved people who had witnessed or experienced such environments, accounts that painted pictures of systematic brutality that exceeded even the harsh realities of cotton cultivation. The average life expectancy for field hands on sugar plantations was significantly lower than other forms of agricultural work, making Jacob's potential sale not merely a separation, but likely a sentence of slow death. The psychological impact of learning about these plans required Mercy to confront the fundamental powerlessness of her position within a system that granted absolute authority to those who owned her and her child. The years of faithful service and demonstrated competence that had earned her relative security meant nothing when balanced against the colonel's assessment of his financial interests and strategic objectives. The remainder of the conversation about birthday celebration planning took on surreal qualities as Mercy found herself discussing menu details and service arrangements while processing the devastating knowledge that the same people she was preparing to serve were casually planning to destroy everything that gave her life meaning. The professional demeanor that had protected her for years became a mask that concealed the rage and desperation threatening to overwhelm her self-control. The walk back to the kitchen house after this conversation provided the first opportunity for Mercy to process the full implications of what she had learned without the need to maintain a facade of compliance and contentment. The familiar pathway between the main house and her workplace seemed different now, transformed from a routine connection between duty stations into a bridge between her current existence and an uncertain future that held only loss and devastation. The evening meal preparation that followed required extraordinary effort to maintain the standards of excellence that had defined her work for over a decade, as Mercy struggled to focus on immediate tasks while her mind obsessed over the countdown that now governed her son's fate. The routine activities of seasoning, timing, and presentation demanded attention that competed with the overwhelming need to develop some strategy for preventing the catastrophe that Colonel Hartwell was planning. Jacob's return from his daily lessons with the plantation tutor took on special significance as Mercy observed her son with the desperate attention of someone trying to memorize details that might soon be lost forever. The boy's natural curiosity and quick intelligence, which had always been sources of pride and hope, now seemed like cruel reminders of potential that would be systematically destroyed if the colonel's plans came to fruition. The birthday celebration that evening included conversations between mother and son that carried additional weight as Mercy found herself struggling with the knowledge that their time together might be more limited than Jacob could imagine. Her careful questioning about his daily activities and future aspirations revealed his innocence about the forces that were shaping his destiny, creating an additional burden of protecting him from knowledge that would only cause unnecessary suffering. The sleepless hours that followed were spent in mental calculations about possible strategies for preventing Jacob's sale. Options that ranged from appealing to the colonel's self-interest to more desperate measures that would require her to risk everything for even a small chance of success. The legal and social systems that supported slavery offered no meaningful recourse for enslaved people seeking to protect their families from arbitrary separation. The gradual evolution of Mercy's thinking during this period reflected the psychological transformation that occurs when conventional options prove inadequate to address existential threats. The progression from hope for reasonable solutions to consideration of extreme measures represented a journey that countless enslaved parents had traveled when confronted with the destruction of their families through sale and separation. The knowledge that old Moses had shared about dangerous mushrooms began to acquire different significance as Mercy considered the limited tools available for challenging a system that offered no legal protection for enslaved families. The technical information about identification, preparation, and dosage that had been intended for safety purposes could obviously be applied for very different objectives by someone with sufficient motivation and opportunity. The birthday celebration that had originally represented simply another professional challenge began to take on symbolic importance as Mercy contemplated the gathering of influential people who supported and benefited from the system that threatened to destroy her family. The opportunity to demonstrate her expertise in mushroom preparation for such an audience acquired meaning that transcended mere culinary excellence and entered the realm of justice that existed outside any legal framework. Part 6. The Transformation of Purpose. The October dawn that broke across Willowbrook Estate 3 weeks before Colonel Hartwell's birthday celebration carried with it the crisp promise of autumn that always reminded Mercy of endings and beginnings. The changing seasons had marked the passage of her 12 years in bondage, each cycle bringing fresh cotton harvests and renewed profits for her owners, while her own life remained suspended in an endless present of servitude and survival. Standing in the kitchen house as the first light filtered through the oiled paper windows, Mercy felt the weight of transformation settling upon her shoulders like a mantle she had never chosen to wear. The woman who had awakened that morning was fundamentally different from the one who had received Colonel Hartwell's devastating news about Jacob's future just days earlier. The careful facade of compliance that had protected her for a decade was beginning to crack under the pressure of knowledge she could neither accept nor ignore. The daily routine of food preparation continued with mechanical precision as Mercy moved through familiar tasks while her mind operated on entirely different levels of consciousness. The physical actions of lighting fires, measuring ingredients, and organizing preparation areas required no conscious thought after years of repetition, leaving her mental faculties free to pursue calculations and possibilities that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Ruby arrived for her morning duties with the cheerful demeanor that had characterized their working relationship for years, chattering about minor gossip from the slave quarters while beginning her assigned tasks of vegetable preparation and bread mixing. The normalcy of these interactions created a surreal contrast with the revolutionary thoughts that now occupied Mercy's consciousness, forcing her to maintain conversational responses while processing scenarios that would determine the fate of everyone at Willowbrook. The breakfast preparation for the main house proceeded according to established patterns that reflected the Hartwell family's predictable preferences and social obligations. Colonel Hartwell required substantial portions of bacon, eggs, and biscuits to fuel his morning inspections of field operations, while Mrs. Constance preferred delicate preparations that would not interfere with her elaborate morning toilette. Victoria's appetite remained modest as befitted a young woman preparing for marriage, though her demands for perfectly prepared coffee revealed the entitled expectations that characterized her generation. The logistics of managing multiple meal services throughout the day had always required careful timing and coordination, but Mercy now found herself analyzing these routines with the strategic attention of someone planning a military campaign. The patterns of family behavior, guest expectations, and service protocols that had once been simply professional considerations now acquired tactical significance as she contemplated actions that would require perfect timing and flawless execution. The conversation with old Moses that occurred during the mid-morning lull between breakfast service and lunch preparation marked a crucial step in Mercy's psychological evolution, from victim to agent of her own destiny. The elderly man's arrival at the kitchen house to deliver vegetables from his garden provided an opportunity for private discussion that would have appeared routine to any casual observer, while actually serving as a consultation between teacher and student about matters of life and death. Moses sensed the change in Mercy's demeanor immediately, recognizing in her expression the same transformation he had witnessed in other enslaved people who had reached the breaking point where conventional survival strategies proved inadequate to address existential threats. His own long experience with the realities of plantation life had taught him to identify the signs of someone contemplating desperate measures, though he remained careful not to provide explicit encouragement for actions that could result in catastrophic consequences for the entire community. The discussion that followed operated on multiple levels of meaning, with both participants understanding that certain topics could only be addressed through careful indirection and implied rather than stated conclusions. Moses shared additional information about mushroom identification and preparation techniques under the guise of expanding Mercy's foraging knowledge for legitimate culinary purposes, while she asked increasingly specific questions about dosage calculations and symptom timing that revealed the direction of her thinking. The detailed technical information that Moses provided about amatoxin concentration in different mushroom species reflected decades of accumulated knowledge about the complex chemistry of natural toxins and their effects on human physiology. His explanations included precise descriptions of preparation methods that could either reduce or concentrate the potency of active compounds, information that was ostensibly intended for safety purposes but could obviously be applied for very different objectives. The conversation about symptom progression and detection methods took on particular significance as Moses described the characteristic delayed onset of amatoxin poisoning that created a window of several hours between consumption and the appearance of initial warning signs. This temporal gap represented both a danger for accidental victims and an opportunity for someone planning deliberate harm, since the delay could allow sufficient time for evidence to be concealed or destroyed before the poisoning was discovered. The specific details about liver and kidney damage that characterized fatal amatoxin poisoning revealed the systematic nature of the physiological destruction caused by these compounds, with progressive organ failure that could not be reversed once the toxins had been absorbed into the bloodstream. Moses's descriptions were based on his observations of accidental poisoning cases over the years, tragic incidents that had provided grim lessons about the importance of absolute caution when dealing with wild mushrooms. The practical guidance about harvesting locations and optimal timing for mushroom collection gave Mercy the information needed to obtain specimens at peak potency while maintaining the appearance of routine foraging activities. Moses identified specific areas within the surrounding forests where deathcap mushrooms could be found in abundance during the current season, along with recommendations about weather conditions and harvesting techniques that would preserve their toxic properties. The conclusion of their conversation included Moses's carefully worded warnings about the irreversible nature of certain actions and the potential consequences that could extend far beyond intended targets. His references to community safety and collective responsibility represented an attempt to ensure that Mercy understood the broader implications of any extreme measures she might be contemplating, though he stopped short of explicitly discouraging her from pursuing whatever course of action her desperation might demand. The afternoon meal preparation that followed this consultation provided Mercy with her first opportunity to apply the theoretical knowledge she had gained to practical considerations about the upcoming birthday celebration. The detailed menu planning that Mrs. Constance had outlined included multiple dishes featuring wild mushrooms, creating natural opportunities for incorporating additional ingredients that would not appear suspicious to anyone unfamiliar with the subtle distinctions between edible and lethal varieties. The guest list for the Colonel's birthday represented a comprehensive
assembly of regional power brokers whose collective influence shaped everything from local law enforcement to state political policies. Judge Thomas Pemberton's presence would bring the legal authority that legitimized the slave system, while Captain James Mitchell's commercial connections facilitated the economic networks that made plantation agriculture profitable. The Blackwood family from Riverside Plantation represented social peers whose support maintained the Colonel's position within the regional elite. The symbolic significance of targeting such a gathering began to acquire meaning that transcended personal revenge and entered the realm of systematic resistance to the institutional structures that perpetuated human bondage. The opportunity to strike at the heart of the power network that sustained slavery in Mississippi represented a chance to deliver a message that would resonate throughout the region and beyond, demonstrating that even the most privileged members of plantation society remained vulnerable to those they had dismissed as powerless property. The technical challenges involved in executing such a plan required careful consideration of dosage calculations, preparation methods, and distribution strategies that would ensure effectiveness while minimizing the risk of detection. The delayed onset of amatoxin poisoning provided tactical advantages, but also created complications related to evidence disposal and establishing credible alternative explanations for any suspicious circumstances that might arise during the investigation that would inevitably follow. The psychological preparation required for contemplating mass murder demanded that Mercy reconcile her fundamental moral beliefs with the harsh realities of a system that offered no legal remedies for the injustices that threatened to destroy her family.
The progression from passive resistance to active violence represented a transformation that required her to embrace aspects of herself that she had never previously acknowledged or developed. The evening hours following her consultation with Moses were spent in solitary reflection, as Mercy weighed the moral complexities of her situation against the practical considerations that would govern any attempt to protect Jacob from his threatened fate. The knowledge that conventional appeals to mercy or justice would prove futile in a system designed to treat enslaved people as property left her with options that required her to accept responsibility for consequences that would extend far beyond her personal grievances. The relationship between mother and son took on additional poignancy as Mercy observed Jacob during their evening meal, noting the innocent enthusiasm with which he discussed his daily lessons and future aspirations. The boy's natural optimism and trust in the basic fairness of the world represented qualities that the slave system was designed to crush, making his protection not just a personal necessity, but a form of resistance to the dehumanizing processes that surrounded them. The bedtime conversations that had always provided opportunities for nurturing Jacob's intellectual development now served the additional purpose of gathering information about his daily routines and interactions with other plantation personnel. Mercy's careful questioning revealed the extent to which her son had begun to internalize the social expectations of his position, accepting limitations on his future that she found increasingly unbearable to witness. The planning process that occupied Mercy's thoughts during the sleepless hours that followed required her to consider multiple scenarios and contingencies, while maintaining the appearance of normal behavior during her daily interactions with other plantation personnel. The technical aspects of mushroom preparation needed to be balanced against practical considerations about timing, distribution, and evidence disposal that would determine whether her actions achieved their intended objectives or merely resulted in her own destruction. The gradual evolution of her strategy reflected the intersection of technical knowledge, tactical opportunity, and moral justification that had transformed her from a skilled cook into something far more dangerous. The birthday celebration that had originally represented simply another professional challenge now served as the focal point for a plan that would test every assumption about power, justice, and survival in the antebellum South.
Species, though their beneficial role in forest ecosystems did nothing to reduce their lethal properties when consumed by unsuspecting humans. The identification process that Moses had taught her required careful attention to multiple physical characteristics that distinguished deadly Amanita species from harmless varieties that might appear similar to untrained observers. The white gills beneath the mushroom caps, the distinctive bulbous base of the stem, and the persistent ring around the upper stem provided reliable identifying features that Mercy had memorized through repeated practice and detailed instruction. The seasonal timing of her expedition coincided with optimal growing conditions for Amanita mushrooms, when recent rainfall and moderate temperatures had created perfect circumstances for the development of mature fruiting bodies containing maximum concentrations of amatoxin compounds. The specimens she sought would be at peak potency during this period, requiring smaller quantities to achieve the desired effects while maintaining the plausible appearance of accidental contamination if her activities were later investigated. The harvesting process itself demanded meticulous care to preserve both the toxic properties of the mushrooms and their physical appearance for culinary applications. Mercy selected only the most perfect specimens, avoiding any that showed signs of decay or insect damage that might affect their potency or create suspicious appearances when incorporated into prepared dishes. Each mushroom was carefully cut at the base of the stem and wrapped individually in cloth to prevent contamination or cross-contamination with legitimate ingredients. The quantity she gathered represented a careful calculation based on Moses's estimates of effective dosage requirements for the number of guests expected at the birthday celebration. The concentration of amatoxins in individual mushrooms varied according to growing conditions and maturity, requiring her to collect sufficient specimens to ensure adequate potency while avoiding quantities so large that they might be noticed by anyone familiar with normal mushroom gathering activities. The return journey to the plantation required even greater caution than her outbound trip, since the increasing daylight would make her more visible to anyone who might be moving through the area during early morning routines. Mercy followed a different route back to the slave quarters, using her knowledge of plantation geography to avoid areas where she might encounter field hands beginning their daily labor or overseers conducting their morning inspections. The concealment of her deadly harvest within the kitchen house presented logistical challenges that required careful planning to avoid detection by Ruby or other workers who might notice unusual ingredients among the standard supplies used for meal preparation. The mushrooms needed to be stored in conditions that would preserve their potency while remaining accessible for incorporation into the birthday feast preparations that would begin in earnest during the following week. The drying and processing techniques that Moses had described allowed Mercy to transform the fresh mushrooms into a concentrated powder that could be easily incorporated into complex dishes without creating obvious evidence of contamination. The grinding process required careful attention to avoid inhaling particles that could cause harm, while the resulting powder needed to be stored in containers that would prevent accidental exposure to innocent kitchen workers. The technical aspects of amatoxin concentration and distribution demanded precise calculations about the quantity of powder required to ensure lethal doses for all intended targets, while avoiding detection through taste or appearance. The toxic compounds were reportedly tasteless and odorless, characteristics that made them particularly dangerous for unsuspecting victims, but also ideal for someone planning deliberate poisoning of multiple individuals. The integration of the deadly powder into specific dishes required strategic thinking about which preparations would most effectively mask any subtle changes in texture or appearance, while ensuring that all intended targets would consume adequate quantities. The venison and mushroom stew that represented Colonel Hartwell's favorite dish provided ideal vehicle for concealing additional mushroom ingredients, since the complex flavors and textures of the preparation would disguise any irregularities that might otherwise be noticed. The psychological impact of completing her forest expedition marked a crucial transformation in Mercy's mental state, as the abstract planning phase of her revenge evolved into concrete preparations with physical evidence of her intentions. The possession of sufficient toxic material to achieve her objectives created a point of no return that required her to either proceed with her plan or find some way to safely dispose of substances that could potentially harm innocent people if mishandled. The knowledge that she now possessed the means to protect Jacob from his threatened sale created a sense of empowerment that had been absent from her experience of enslaved life, though this feeling was balanced by awareness of the enormous risks associated with her chosen course of action. The success of her plan would depend on flawless execution during the birthday celebration, while failure would result in consequences that could extend to everyone in the slave community at Willowbrook. The remainder of the morning was spent in careful concealment of evidence and establishment of routines that would provide alibis for her forest expedition if anyone noticed her absence from the slave quarters during the early hours. The normalcy of her breakfast preparation duties provided effective cover for any unusual behavior that might have resulted from the stress of her clandestine activities, while her interactions with Ruby and other kitchen workers required careful management to avoid revealing any changes in her emotional state. The afternoon brought renewed contact with old Moses, who delivered vegetables from his garden while carefully observing Mercy's demeanor for signs of how she had processed their recent conversations about mushroom identification and preparation techniques. The brief exchange that occurred during this visit operated on multiple levels of meaning, with both participants understanding that certain topics could only be addressed through subtle indirection rather than explicit discussion. Moses's final words of caution about the irreversible nature of certain actions represented his last attempt to ensure that Mercy fully understood the magnitude of what she was contemplating, though he avoided providing specific discouragement that might be interpreted as failure to support someone facing impossible circumstances. The delicate balance between providing necessary information and maintaining plausible deniability required careful attention to language and implication rather than direct statement. The evening meal preparation that concluded the day provided Mercy with her first opportunity to test the incorporation techniques she had learned, using small quantities of harmless mushroom powder to experiment with distribution methods and visual effects. The results of these trials would inform her final preparations for the birthday celebration, ensuring that she understood exactly how to achieve optimal results when the moment arrived for implementing her plan. The psychological preparation for mass murder required Mercy to reconcile her fundamental beliefs about the sanctity of human life with the harsh realities of a system that had consistently demonstrated its willingness to destroy enslaved families for economic convenience. The progression from victim to executioner demanded that she embrace aspects of herself that contradicted everything she had been taught about proper behavior and moral responsibility, while accepting that conventional notions of justice had proven inadequate to address her situation. Part 8. The birthday approaches. The week preceding Colonel Hartwell's 50th birthday celebration transformed Willowbrook Estate into a theater of frantic preparation, as every aspect of the plantation's domestic operation was mobilized to create an event that would cement the family's reputation for hospitality while demonstrating their continued prominence within Mississippi's social hierarchy. The magnitude of the undertaking required coordination between multiple departments of enslaved workers, each responsible for specific elements that would contribute to the overall success of an evening designed to impress the region's most influential citizens. Mrs. Constance Hartwell assumed direct supervision of the planning process, with the commanding presence that had made her one of Natchez society's most respected hostesses, issuing detailed instructions about everything from floral arrangements to musical entertainment, while maintaining the exacting standards that guests had come to expect from social events at Willowbrook. Her vision for the celebration included elements that would showcase both the family's refined tastes and their command of resources that allowed them to provide experiences unavailable to less prosperous households. The guest list had expanded beyond the original conception to include several additional prominent families, whose attendance would enhance the political and social significance of the gathering. The final count of expected attendees reached 23 people, including children from neighboring plantation families who would participate in the evening's festivities alongside their parents. The increased number of guests created additional pressure on the kitchen staff while providing Mercy with a larger target population for her planned intervention. The menu planning process involved extensive consultations between Mrs. Hartwell and Mercy about dishes that would demonstrate culinary sophistication while accommodating the varied preferences of guests, whose dietary habits and regional loyalties needed to be considered in creating a truly memorable dining experience. The complexity of the proposed preparations required advanced ordering of specialized ingredients, along with careful scheduling of cooking processes that would ensure optimal timing for service throughout the evening. The centerpiece of the planned menu remained the venison and mushroom stew that had become Colonel Hartwell's signature dish, prepared according to a recipe that Mercy had perfected over years of experimentation with different combinations of wild game and foraged fungi. The Colonel's particular pride in this preparation stemmed from his belief that it represented a uniquely American contribution to fine dining, combining frontier hunting traditions with sophisticated cooking techniques that demonstrated the cultural advancement of Southern society. The procurement of ingredients for the celebration required coordination with suppliers throughout the Natchez region, as Mrs. Hartwell insisted on obtaining the finest available components for each dish regardless of cost considerations. The venison would come from recent hunting expeditions on Willowbrook property, while other elements would be purchased from established merchants who specialize in serving the needs of plantation households with unlimited budgets and exacting requirements. The logistical challenges of preparing multiple courses for such a large gathering demanded careful organization of cooking schedules and workspace allocation within the kitchen house, where Mercy would need to coordinate the efforts of several assistant cooks while maintaining personal supervision over the most critical preparations. The timing requirements for optimal service created narrow windows for completing specific tasks, leaving little margin for error in executing complex procedures under intense pressure. Ruby's role in the celebration preparations expanded significantly as she assumed responsibility for many routine tasks that would normally occupy Mercy's attention, allowing the head cook to focus on the specialized techniques required for the more elaborate dishes. The delegation of responsibilities required careful instruction and supervision to ensure that quality standards were maintained, while freeing Mercy to concentrate on preparations that could not be entrusted to less experienced workers. The arrival of additional house servants borrowed from neighboring plantations created a temporary expansion of the domestic staff that would provide the manpower necessary for serving such a large group, while maintaining the standards of elegance that characterized Willowbrook's reputation for exceptional hospitality. The integration of unfamiliar workers into established routines required diplomatic management from Samuel, whose role as head butler included responsibility for coordinating service protocols and ensuring seamless execution during the actual celebration. The physical preparations within the main house involved rearranging furniture to accommodate the expanded guest list, while creating an atmosphere that would enhance the evening's festive mood through strategic use of candles, flowers, and decorative elements that reflected the autumn season. The great dining room would serve as the focal point for the evening's activities, with its massive oak table extended to full capacity and adorned with the finest linens, crystal, and silver that the Hartwell family had accumulated over 3 generations of prosperity. The entertainment plan for the evening included musical performances by guests with particular talents, along with dancing that would utilize the spacious parlor areas adjacent to the dining room. Victoria Hartwell would perform several piano pieces that she had been practicing for months, while other guests were expected to contribute recitations, songs, or instrumental performances that would provide sophisticated amusement following the completion of the elaborate dinner service. The security considerations for such a gathering included arrangements for accommodating the personal servants who would accompany various guests, along with provisions for the additional horses and carriages that would require attention throughout the evening. The coordination of these practical details fell primarily to the male enslaved workers who managed the plantation's transportation and stable facilities, though their activities would be carefully monitored to ensure that no unauthorized persons gained access to sensitive areas of the property. Mercy's mental state during this period of intense preparation reflected the complex psychological processes involved in maintaining normal behavioral patterns while contemplating actions that would fundamentally violate every social and moral constraint that had governed her existence for over a decade. The necessity of appearing completely normal during her interactions with other plantation personnel required extraordinary self-control as she processed the magnitude of what she was planning to accomplish. The technical aspects of incorporating lethal mushroom powder into the birthday feast required detailed planning about timing, distribution methods, and concealment strategies that would prevent detection while ensuring effective dosage for all intended targets. The venison stew provided an ideal vehicle for achieving these objectives, since its complex preparation process would allow multiple opportunities for introducing additional ingredients without creating suspicious deviations from established recipes. The psychological preparation for executing mass murder demanded that Mercy develop emotional detachment mechanisms that would allow her to function effectively during the actual poisoning while maintaining the facade of loyal service that had protected her for so many years. The transformation from victim to executioner required her to embrace capabilities that contradicted fundamental aspects of her personality and moral training, creating internal conflicts that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure.
The countdown to the celebration created a temporal framework that intensified every aspect of Mercy's emotional and psychological state as she approached the point of no return where abstract planning would give way to irreversible action. The knowledge that Jacob's fate hung in the balance added urgency to her preparations, while reinforcing her determination to proceed with a plan that offered the only realistic hope of protecting her son from the devastating future that Colonel Hartwell had planned for him. The final preparations for the deadly feast would require Mercy to balance her legitimate responsibilities as head cook with the clandestine activities necessary for implementing her revenge, creating a dual existence that tested every survival skill she had developed during her years of enslavement. The success or failure of her plan would depend on her ability to maintain perfect performance in both roles while avoiding any behavior that might alert others to the true nature of her intentions. Part 9. The Fatal Preparation Day. The morning of September 23rd dawned with the crystalline clarity that October skies sometimes provide as a gift to those facing moments of irreversible consequence. Mercy awakened in the slave quarters before the first cock-crow, her body responding to an internal chronometer that had been calibrated by months of planning and psychological preparation for this singular day when abstract intentions would transform into concrete action that would reshape the fate of everyone at Willowbrook Estate. The pre-dawn hours provided the only period when she could review her preparations without the constant presence of other kitchen workers whose innocent observations might later prove problematic if investigations revealed inconsistencies in her behavior or deviations from established routines. The solitude of early morning allowed her to mentally rehearse the complex sequence of actions that would be required to successfully incorporate lethal ingredients into the birthday feast while maintaining the facade of loyal service that had protected her throughout her years of bondage. The deadly mushroom powder that represented the culmination of weeks of planning sat concealed within a small tin container that appeared identical to the various spice containers routinely used in the preparation of elaborate meals. The careful labeling and positioning of this crucial component among legitimate cooking supplies created a hiding place that would remain invisible to casual observation, while remaining easily accessible during the critical moments when timing would determine the success or failure of her entire enterprise. Ruby's arrival for her morning duties marked the beginning of a day that would require Mercy to function simultaneously as the trusted head cook responsible for creating a memorable celebration and as an agent of retribution whose actions would test every assumption about power, loyalty, and justice in the antebellum South. The maintenance of normal interactions with her assistant demanded extraordinary self-control as Mercy processed the knowledge that this would be the last day of innocent collaboration between them. The breakfast service for the main house proceeded according to established patterns that reflected years of carefully developed routines designed to satisfy the Hartwell family's predictable preferences while providing efficient foundation for the more elaborate preparations that would dominate the remainder of the day. Colonel Hartwell's hearty appetite for bacon and eggs provided no indication that he was consuming what would prove to be his final breakfast, while Mrs. Constance's delicate selection of toast and preserves represented the last meal she would ever enjoy in peaceful ignorance of her approaching fate. The morning consultations between Mrs. Hartwell and Mercy about final details for the evening's menu created opportunities for the head cook to demonstrate the professional competence and apparent loyalty that had earned her years of trust while concealing the fundamental transformation that had occurred in her relationship with the family she served. The discussions about timing, presentation, and service protocols proceeded with the same attention to detail that had characterized previous special occasions, creating no indication that anything had changed in the domestic arrangements that supported the plantation's social functions. The arrival of additional supplies and borrowed kitchen equipment from neighboring plantations created increased activity levels that provided excellent cover for any unusual behavior that might result from the psychological pressure of implementing a plan that would determine whether Jacob lived or died according to the whims of people who viewed enslaved families as divisible property. The coordination of these additional resources required diplomatic management from Mercy, while creating opportunities for hiding critical elements of her revenge plan, for concealing evidence of her clandestine preparations.
The mid-morning hunting expedition that would provide the venison for the evening's centerpiece dish proceeded according to schedules that had been established weeks earlier, with Colonel Hartwell personally leading a group of male enslaved workers into the forest areas where game remained abundant despite decades of plantation development. The success of this expedition was crucial for the evening's menu, though its outcome would prove far more significant than anyone except Mercy could possibly understand. The processing of the freshly killed deer required immediate attention to preserve the quality of meat that would serve as the foundation for the elaborate stew preparation that represented both Colonel Hartwell's favorite dish and the ideal vehicle for introducing additional ingredients that would remain undetectable until their effects became irreversibly apparent. The butchering process provided Mercy with opportunities to inspect the meat quality while planning the incorporation strategies that would determine the effectiveness of her intervention. The preparation of legitimate mushroom components for the stew began with a carefully orchestrated expedition to gathering sites that Moses had identified during their recent consultations, though this foraging activity served multiple purposes beyond the obvious need for authentic ingredients. The collection of harmless mushroom varieties provided cover for Mercy's familiarity with forest locations, while creating plausible explanations for any evidence that might later suggest her involvement in activities beyond normal food preparation duties. The complex cooking process that would transform raw ingredients into the elaborate venison and mushroom stew required multiple stages of preparation that created natural opportunities for introducing additional components without creating suspicious deviations from established recipes. The early stages of browning meat and developing flavor bases would mask any subtle changes that might result from incorporating carefully prepared additions to the standard ingredient list. The critical moment for adding the lethal mushroom powder arrived during the final seasoning phase of stew preparation, when the complexity of flavors and textures would make detection virtually impossible while ensuring thorough distribution throughout the entire batch. The timing of this addition required precise coordination with other cooking activities to avoid observation by Ruby or other kitchen workers whose innocent presence might create complications if they later recalled unusual behavior during this crucial period. The incorporation process itself demanded steady hands and absolute confidence as Mercy measured the carefully calculated quantity of deadly powder that would ensure effective dosage for all intended targets, while avoiding concentrations so high that they might be detected through taste or appearance. The months of planning and technical consultation with Moses had provided the knowledge necessary for these calculations, though the actual implementation created psychological pressure that tested every aspect of her emotional control. The completion of stew preparation without detection represented a crucial milestone in the execution of Mercy's plan, though the success of her intervention would ultimately depend on factors beyond her direct control, including guest attendance patterns and individual consumption preferences. The knowledge that she had successfully introduced lethal ingredients into the birthday feast created a point of no return that transformed abstract planning into irreversible commitment to consequences that would extend far beyond her personal grievances. The afternoon preparations for additional dishes and service protocols proceeded with mechanical precision as Mercy fought to maintain normal behavior patterns while processing the psychological impact of having committed herself to actions that would result in multiple deaths within hours. The surreal quality of preparing elaborate food presentations for people she had already poisoned created cognitive dissonance that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The arrival of early guests during the late afternoon created additional pressure as Mercy observed the animated conversations and social interactions that characterized the beginning of what would become the final gathering for most of the assembled company. The knowledge that she possessed exclusive awareness of their approaching fate created a sense of power that had been entirely absent from her previous experience of enslaved life, though this feeling was balanced by recognition of the enormous personal risks associated with her chosen course of action. The final stages of meal preparation required coordination with serving staff who would be responsible for presenting the deadly feast with the same attention to elegance and hospitality that had characterized previous social events at Willowbrook Estate. The irony of maintaining perfect service standards while delivering death to unsuspecting guests created moral complexities that Mercy had accepted as necessary consequences of protecting Jacob from the fate that Colonel Hartwell had planned for him. The psychological transformation that accompanied these final preparations reflected the complete abandonment of conventional moral constraints in favor of a form of justice that operated outside any legal or social framework that might have provided alternative remedies for her situation. The progression from victim to executioner represented a journey that countless enslaved people had contemplated when faced with threats to their families, though few had possessed the knowledge and opportunity necessary for implementing such systematic revenge. The countdown to dinner service created temporal pressure that intensified every aspect of Mercy's emotional state as she approached the moment when years of careful planning would either achieve their intended objectives or result in her own destruction along with that of her son. The success of her plan depended on maintaining perfect performance during the service of a meal that would deliver death to everyone who had supported and benefited from the system that had threatened to separate her from the only thing that gave her life meaning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.